You know, when you picture the Caribbean, it's easy to think, paradise sun, beaches, clear water.
Right. Total paradise vibe.
But if you peel back that layer, there's this incredible history, audacious acts, legendary figures, and this massive disruption on the seas. Caribbean piracy. We're about to take a deep dive.
Exactly. And we're focusing on what most people call the Golden Age of Piracy. Roughly, what, mid-1650s to the 1730s?
Yeah, from then.
It's a time when robbing ships wasn't just, random attacks. It was widespread. Almost like unauthorized naval warfare.
Yeah.
Happening right in this crucial sea lane connecting Europe to the colonies.
Crucial is definitely the word. The Caribbean wasn't just pretty. It was like the main artery for empires. Spain, England, France, the Dutch.
Pumping wealth back to Europe.
Exactly. And where you have that much money moving around, well, you're going to attract people looking for a shortcut. We're talking huge losses, millions of Spanish dollars back then.
Which would be billions today.
Easy. Serious money. This wasn't just swashbuckling fun. It hit economies hard. So let's get into it. What kicked this whole golden age off? What were the conditions like?
Oh, it's fascinating how it all links back to the big powers, the empires.
Yeah.
Spain basically had a monopoly on trade there since the 1500s.
Right, they were there first, claimed it all.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
But then England, France, the Netherlands, they all wanted a piece of the action. They wanted colonies, access to that wealth. So you get tension, competition.
Conflict.
Yeah, constant conflict. And that kind of atmosphere, it made aggression on the seas almost normal, even if it wasn't strictly legal.
Which sounds like a perfect lead-in to privateering. It feels like a bit of a gray area, doesn't it? One minute you have permission to attack enemy ships, the next, maybe not.
That's exactly the slippery slope. These letters of marque were official documents. They let private ship owners attack enemy shipping during wartime.
Like state-sponsored piracy, almost?
Kind of, yeah. A way to boost the Navy without the cost. But the problem came during peacetime. Suddenly you have all these skilled armed sailors.
With nothing to do.
Right. Few legit jobs. But the treasure ships are still sailing past. For many, just continuing what they were doing, but without the official papers.
Well, it wasn't a huge leap. The line got really blurry. Piracy just made sense to them.
So you've got this pool of experienced sailors out of work in a target-rich environment. Seems almost inevitable, yeah? And then there's this group, the Brethren of the Coast. Who were they exactly? Sounds intriguing.
They're a really interesting early phase. They started more as buccaneers on Hispaniola and later Tortuga. Initially hunters, actually. Wild cattle and pigs.
Oh, right. The Buccaneers.
That's
From Buchan, the smoking frame.
Exactly that. But they gradually shifted from hunting on land to raiding ships at sea. What's key is they started developing early forms of organization, pirate codes, ways to govern themselves.
So not just a chaotic mob.
No, not entirely. They had rules about behavior, sharing loot. You can kind of see them as a proto-pirate collective, setting the stage for the more organized crews later on. A proto-pirate collective. I like that. Okay, so these groups needed bases, right? Some were safe, away from the authorities. These legendary pirate havens. What were the main ones?
The Caribbean had quite a few spots. Port Royal in Jamaica is probably the most infamous. After the English took Jamaica in 1655, it boomed.
But not just with legitimate trade.
Oh no, it became a huge hub for privateers and then just outright pirates. It got this reputation, the wickedest city on earth, because so much questionable money flowed through there.
Wickedest city until
the huge earthquake in 1692 just devastated the place. That quake basically ended Port Royal's reign as the top pirate spot. It's seen as a real turning point, forcing pirates to look elsewhere.
Wow, a literal earthquake shaking up the pirate world. So where did they go after Port Royal was, well, sunk?
Well, even before Port Royal's peak, Tortuga Island was important. Off Hispaniola, started back in the 1630s.
Strategic location.
Perfect location, right near the Spanish shipping lanes. It was a big base for French and English buccaneers. And what's interesting there is you really see this self-governed pirate society emerge. They actually elected leaders.
Really? Elected?
Yeah, showed a level of independence. Then later, Nassau in the Bahamas becomes huge. Maybe the most important pirate republic, say from around 1706 to 1718.
Nassau, okay. That's where all the big names were.
Yeah, estimates are maybe 2,000 pirates based there at its height. You had Blackbeard, Charles Vane, Calico, Jack Rackham, all operating out of Nassau. And there were others, too, like New Providence, St. Mary's Island, way over by Madagascar.
Madagascar, that's far.
It is, but it was connected to the whole network. And even places like Barataria Bay in Louisiana later on.
So a whole network of these outlaw towns. And the pirates themselves, the individuals, they're the ones we remember. Henry Morgan, Blackbeard, Black Bart.
Yeah.
What made them so legendary?
There were definitely characters. Take Henry Morgan, Welsh guy, starts as a privateer, does incredibly well, ends up lieutenant governor of Jamaica.
Quite the career change.
Isn't it? Famous for sacking Panama City in 1671. Led about 1,200 men. The loot was apparently enormous, maybe 30 million in today's money. His story really shows how blurry that line between privateer and pirate was early on.
And then there's Blackbeard, maybe the most famous image of a pirate.
Edward Teach, yeah. His fame wasn't just what he did, but his image. Pure theater, sticking lit fuses in his beard before battle.
Terrifying.
Totally. Pure psychological warfare. He commanded the Queen Anne's Revenge, a big 40-gun ship,
Yeah.
and he famously blockaded Charleston Harbor in 1718, just stopped all ships, demanded medical supplies.
Held a whole city hostage.
Pretty much. Shows how powerful they could be.
Blackbeard definitely knew branding. What about Bartholomew Black Bart Roberts? You hear he was the most successful.
By the numbers, yes. Bartholomew Roberts captured more ships than anyone else in the Golden Age. Over 470 vessels.
470, wow.
Yeah, incredible record. But interestingly, he was apparently quite strict, had ship's articles, rules. No gambling, lights out at 8 p.m.
Rules on a pirate ship, that seems odd.
It does, but maybe it kept things orderly. Anyway, he eventually died in battle against a British warship, HMS Swallow.
A surprising level of discipline for such a ruthless job. Now, we absolutely have to talk about Anne Bonny and Mary Read. Female pirates. That's extraordinary for the time.
It really is. Anne Bonny and Mary Read just completely defied expectations, sailing and fighting alongside men under Calico Jack Rackham.
And they disguise themselves as men.
For much of their careers, yeah.
Ooh.
And by all accounts, they were fierce fighters. Some stories say they fought harder than the men when their ship was finally captured in 1720.
Amazing. And they avoided hanging, right?
They did, initially, by pleating their bellies, claiming they were pregnant, which delayed execution. Their stories just captivating. Really challenges how we think about gender roles back then.
Absolutely remarkable. It paints a picture of a pirate society that maybe wasn't quite what we imagine. You mentioned rules, codes. Was there actual democracy on these ships?
It's really striking. Many crews developed these written ship's articles. Basically, rules for how to behave, punishments, and critically, how to divide the spoils.
So like a contract.
Kind of, yeah. And many operated pretty democratically. They often voted for their captain and also for the quartermaster, who often held the power over discipline and loot distribution.
The voted.
Yeah. Black Bart's code, for instance, specifically gave everyone equal voting rights and laid out clear shares of any treasure. It was way more egalitarian than life on a typical merchant ship or a naval vessel, which could be incredibly harsh and hierarchical.
So in a way, these pirate ships were fairer societies than the ones they were attacking. That's quite an idea. What about race? Was it just white Europeans?
No, and that's another area that busts some myths. Estimates are that maybe 25, even 30% of pirates were of African descent, many formerly enslaved people.
Holy, that high.
Yeah. For someone escaping slavery, a pirate ship offered freedom, a share of wealth, a chance at respect, things completely unavailable almost anywhere else. Compared to other ships, pirate crews were often much more mixed and, relatively speaking, egalitarian across racial lines. We even know names of prominent black pirates like Black Caesar or Diego el Mulato.
That completely changes the picture. It sounds like a much more complex world than just, eye patches and parrots. What about just the day-to-day grind? It couldn't all be fighting and treasure.
Oh, definitely not. Daily life was mostly routine. Ship maintenance, navigation, standing watch. You needed skilled people, carpenters, navigators, maybe a surgeon if you were lucky.
And keeping busy between raids.
Keeping morale up was key. So music, gambling, storytelling, lots of drinking probably. But it was tough. Food was often terrible. Weevils in the biscuits, rancid meat, not enough fresh water. Scurvy and other diseases were rampant. Hygiene was basic at best.
Right. Not exactly the romantic life. And the flag, the Jolly Roger. That skull and crossbones is so iconic. Where did that come from?
The Jolly Roger is the classic, but it wasn't standardized. It evolved. Different captains had their own versions, maybe a full skeleton, an hourglass, bleeding hearts, weapons.
So personalized flags.
Yeah. The main point was psychological warfare. Hoist the flag, hope the other ship just surrenders immediately to avoid a fight. Saves gunpowder, saves lives on both sides. A specific flag could become famous, tied to a captain's reputation for being ruthless, or maybe even for offering quarter.
Visual branding again, designed to instill fear. Okay, we've talked about the people, their society, but some of the specific stories are just legendary. What are some standout tales?
Oh, there's some great ones. The wreck of the Whydah Galley is amazing. Captained by Black Sam Bellamy, they called him the richest pirate, though his career was short.
The Whydah, that's one they found, right?
Exactly. It sank in a massive storm off Cape Cod in 1717, loaded with treasure, supposedly over $100 million worth in today's money. Finding it in 1984 was huge. The first authenticated pirate shipwreck ever discovered. Real sunken treasure.
Incredible. A direct link back to that time. What other big stories are there?
Well, the Siege of Cartagena back in 1697. That wasn't just a raid. It was practically a military campaign, led by a French privateer, Jean-Baptiste Ducasse, with maybe 1,200 buccaneers.
1,200? That's an army.
Pretty much. They besieged this heavily fortified city for 2 months and eventually sacked it. The plunder was immense, maybe 10 million livres. It really shows what organized pirate forces were capable of.
Wow. And you mentioned Blackbeard's blockade earlier.
Right, Charleston, 1718. Not a siege, but just by parking his ships in the harbor and grabbing some prominent citizens as hostages, he brought the city to its knees until they gave him medicine. It just underlined how vulnerable even major colonial towns could be.
They really held significant power at times, and we have to circle back to Anne Bonny and Mary Read's last stand.
Absolutely. The story goes that when Calico Jack's ship was attacked and about to be captured in 1720, most of the male crew were drunk or hiding below deck.
But not them.
Not according to the accounts. Bonny and Read were supposedly on deck, fighting fiercely. Legend says they yelled at the men to come up and fight like men. Their defiance, even in capture, and then avoiding the noose by pleading pregnancy. It just adds to their mystique.
Incredible stories. Really brings the era to life, but obviously this golden age couldn't go on forever. How did the authorities fight back?
Eventually, the major powers decided enough was enough. They really cracked down. It was a combined effort. More naval patrols, especially the British Royal Navy after about 1718, they got more organized, more ships in the Caribbean.
So more warships hunting them.
Exactly.
Okay.
Spain also used its guardacostas, Coast Guard ships, and merchants started sailing in convoys more often, groups of ships protected by naval escorts. Made them harder targets.
Okay, a stronger military response. What about legally? Did the laws change?
Yes, that was key too. There was an act passed in 1700, the Act for the More Effectual Suppression of Piracy. It made it easier to try pirates, often in colonial courts, sometimes even at sea. There were famous trials in places like Boston, London, even back in Port Royal before the earthquake.
Made it riskier legally.
Definitely. And governments gradually stopped issuing those letters of marque. The whole system shifted towards professional navies doing the fighting, which made the distinction between legal privateering and illegal piracy much clearer. The gray area shrank.
So the net was definitely closing in. What were the main things that really brought the Golden Age to an end?
It was a combination of factors hitting all at once, really. First, those stronger navies. The British Royal Navy, especially in the 1720s, just became much more effective at hunting pirates down. Better ships, better tactics.
Made it too dangerous.
Exactly. Then, the economics changed. The huge Spanish cruiser fleets became less frequent, less predictable. Trade routes became generally more secure. And importantly, the colonies themselves started developing more. There were more legitimate, maybe safer ways to make a living.
Less incentive to risk your neck pirating?
Possibly, yeah. And the final piece was losing the safe havens, places like Nassau. When Woodes Rogers became governor of the Bahamas in 1718, his mission was basically to stamp out piracy there. He offered pardons, but also used force. Colonial powers gradually asserted control over those lawless islands. No safe place to hide, repair, or sell your loot.
So stronger enforcement, changing money flows, and nowhere safe to run. Makes sense it would eventually fade out. But the fascination, that hasn't faded at all. How come these figures still loom so large?
The cultural impact is just immense, isn't it? It started early with books like Captain Charles Johnson's A General History of the Pirates in 1724. That book basically created many of the pirate stereotypes we know.
The source of many legends.
Absolutely. Then you get Robert Louis Stevenson's Treasure Island, which cemented the romantic image. And today, massive franchises like Pirates of the Caribbean keep introducing these ideas to new audiences.
And the archaeology helps too, finding the ships.
Oh, definitely. Finding the Whydah Galley was huge. The ongoing work at the Port Royal underwater site, discovering what's believed to be Blackbeard's Queen Anne's Revenge off North Carolina in '96. These finds make it real.
Tangible history.
Exactly. And you see it in tourism too. Pirate-themed stuff is big business in the Caribbean, brings in hundreds of millions. Museums, festivals, preservation efforts, the history is alive.
It's amazing how a relatively short period, historically speaking, still grabs us like that. Quick question about today, though. Is Caribbean piracy still a thing?
Unfortunately, yes, in a way. There's been a sort of resurgence of small-scale piracy since the 80s, but it's very different from the Golden Age.
Guess so.
Today, it's more likely to be theft from yachts, maybe drug runners involved, sometimes targeting tourists in isolated spots. It's not the large-scale, almost military operations of the past, targeting major shipping lanes for imperial treasure. Different scale, different motives.
So not quite Blackbeard blockading ports.
No, definitely not. The response now involves regional cooperation between coast guards and navies, surveillance technology, things like that. It's a modern crime problem, not really comparable to the historical era.
Gotcha. Well, wrapping up this deep dive, it's clear that Caribbean piracy was way more than just adventure stories. It was tied up in empire, economics, law. It really shaped the region.
Absolutely. It had a real impact on how colonial powers operated, how maritime law developed. And the pirates themselves, their enduring appeal says something about our fascination with rebels, with people who live outside the rules, even if the reality was often brutal and short-lived.
Yeah, it really makes you think about that allure of disruption, of challenging the status quo, doesn't it? Both back then and maybe even in different forms today. A lot to chew on there. Thanks for joining me for this.